I was standing across the street with a cup of coffee when the state regulators arrived at Sawyer's building. I counted 8 of them, which was 2 more than I'd expected. They went in at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, and Sawyer came out in handcuffs at 10:51. He was still in his workout clothes, the expensive kind, with the little embossed logo on the chest, and he stood on the sidewalk, blinking in the autumn light, like a man who had never once considered that this day might come. I finished my coffee and drove to work. That was the end of it for me. The beginning was 18 months earlier, and it started the way these things always seem to start, with something small, something I almost didn't notice. My wife and I had been married for 11 years. We met when I was still active duty, home on leave for a cousin's wedding in Knoxville, and she was working as a yoga instructor at a studio 2 blocks from my mother's house. She was bright and funny, and she smelled like cedar and vanilla, and I was 29 years old and tired of sleeping in places that smelled like diesel. We were engaged within 6 months. I mustered out after my 12th year of service, and we settled in Charlotte, where I took a job with the county as a building inspector. It's not a glamorous job. I drive a county-issued truck and I carry a clipboard, and I look at electrical panels and load-bearing walls and ventilation systems in buildings that most people walk through without ever wondering if they're safe. People see the truck and look right past the man inside it. I never minded that. In the Signal Corps, I'd spent years learning how to be useful without being noticed. It turned out that skill translated well to civilian life. My wife built her business slowly, the way good things are built. By the time this story started, she had a following of about 60,000 on social media, a 4-day-a-week schedule at a studio she partly owned, and a side income doing branded content for wellness companies. She was good at it. She was disciplined and photogenic, and she knew how to make people feel like they were being seen. What she didn't know, what I'd never told her, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because she'd never asked, was that I'd been quietly buying commercial real estate since I was 32. A storage facility in Concord, a small strip mall in Rock Hill, a warehouse space in Gastonia that I leased to a packaging company. I'd set up an LLC before we married, funded it with money I'd saved during my deployments, and I'd just kept adding to it over the years. My accountant handled the books. The income covered the mortgages on the properties and reinvested the rest. I didn't think of it as secret. I thought of it as mine. My wife knew I had some investments. She wasn't interested in the details. She was interested in the life we lived, which was comfortable but not flashy. A 4-bedroom house in a good school district, 2 decent cars, vacations that were nice without being extravagant. She thought I was a building inspector who'd managed his 401k reasonably well. I never corrected her. The thing I noticed first, the small thing, was that she started keeping her phone face down. It sounds trivial when I say it out loud. Plenty of people keep their phones face down. But my wife had always been casual with hers. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter, on the bathroom vanity, on the coffee table while we watched television. She never thought twice about it. So when I noticed the face-down habit starting in late February, noticed it 3 days in a row before I consciously registered what I was seeing, something in the back of my mind filed it quietly away. Then the dinners started running late. Then a weekend wellness retreat in Asheville she'd never mentioned until 48 hours before she left. I didn't snoop. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me. What happened was that her iPad was propped on the kitchen counter one evening in March, charging, and when I walked past it to refill my coffee, a notification lit up the screen. I wasn't looking for anything. I was thinking about a load calculation I needed to finish for a report due the next morning. But the name on the notification stopped me cold. Sawyer. Can't stop thinking about last weekend. You're incredible. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I sat down at the counter, picked up the iPad, and read 3 months of messages. I wish I could describe what that's like, reading something that rearranges the entire architecture of your life. It's not like anger, not at first. It's more like the feeling of stepping off a curb you didn't see. That lurch. That half second where your body hasn't caught up to what's happening yet. Sawyer ran a supplements and wellness brand called Elevate Naturals. He'd reached out to my wife the previous fall about a content partnership, and by January they were exchanging messages that had nothing to do with content. By March they were meeting twice a week. He called her Ness. He told her she deserved someone who matched her energy. He told her that I was holding her back. I kept reading. There was one exchange I've thought about more than any other. My wife had mentioned feeling guilty, not about the affair itself, just about logistics, about covering her tracks. And he had written back, "Don't waste energy on that. He's not going to figure it out. He drives a county truck and looks at pipes all day. You've outgrown him, Ness. That's not a bad thing. It just is what it is. She hadn't pushed back. She'd sent a laughing emoji. I set the iPad down on the counter, face up, exactly where I'd found it. Then I walked out to the garage, sat in my truck in the dark, and thought for a very long time. Here is what I did not do. I did not cry, though I wanted to. I did not call anyone. I did not go back inside and confront her, even though every muscle in my body wanted to. I did not do anything that would let either of them know that something had changed. I'd spent 12 years in the Signal Corps. I'd done 2 tours in places where losing your composure got people killed. I knew how to be still. I knew how to gather information before making a move. And I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, sitting in that dark garage, that losing my temper right now would be the most expensive mistake I would ever make. I went back inside, got ready for bed, and said goodnight to my wife like it was any other Thursday. The next morning, I drove to work and spent my lunch break on the phone with a family law attorney named Beaumont, who'd been recommended to me by a colleague whose own divorce had gone badly 2 years prior. I told Beaumont I needed to understand exactly what I was entitled to and exactly what I was not. I told him about the LLC and the properties. I told him about the iPad. He told me to stop talking and come to his office that afternoon. We met for 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood several important things. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets get divided fairly but not necessarily equally, and assets brought into the marriage and kept genuinely separate may not be as subject to division at all. My LLCs had been formed 4 years before the wedding. The properties inside it had been purchased with premarital funds and kept in accounts my wife had never accessed or contributed to. Beaumont was cautious, as lawyers are, but his caution had a shape to it that I found encouraging. North Carolina is also a one-party consent state for audio recording. I could record any conversation I was personally part of without disclosing it. Adultery remains a legal factor in North Carolina divorce proceedings. Not a massive factor, but a factor. I drove home that evening and made dinner. I asked my wife how her day was. She told me about a client who was struggling with her practice. We ate and watched television and went to bed. She fell asleep easily. I didn't sleep at all. Over the next 3 weeks, I did several things very quietly. I had my accountant prepare documentation establishing the complete history of my LLC, when each property was purchased, with what funds and what the current market value was. He'd been handling my books for 9 years and he knew the history cold. The total, once he laid it all out in a clean report, was just over $2.8 million. I also started paying attention to Sawyer's business. This was where my training became useful. I wasn't looking for personal leverage, or at least that's what I told myself. What I was doing was the same kind of entity review I'd done dozens of times in the Signal Corps before any significant operation. I pulled his business registration. I looked at his product listings. I cross-referenced the health claims on his Elevate Naturals website against FDA guidelines for dietary supplements. What I found was interesting. Several of his flagship products made specific health claims that crossed the line from permissible marketing language into territory the FDA regulates strictly, claims that a supplement could treat or prevent medical conditions. That's a clear violation if you haven't gone through the approval process, which he hadn't. His business was registered in one state, but he was conducting retail sales in North Carolina without proper in-state registration. According to a former employee review I found on a business rating site, he was also paying contracted influencers without issuing proper tax forms. A reporting issue that the State Department of Revenue tends to find interesting. None of this was my business. Strictly speaking, people cut corners. But taken together, it painted a picture of a man who had built his comfortable little empire on a foundation of small shortcuts, and who had probably never had anyone look too closely at the foundation itself. I made some calls, anonymous ones. The FDA has a tip line. So does the State Department of Revenue. I want to be honest about my motivations. I told myself I was reporting genuine violations, which was true. I also knew that an investigation would create problems for Sawyer that would keep him occupied and anxious and far from my wife's orbit. That was also true. I continued living my life. I went to work. I came home. I was attentive and normal and gave my wife no reason to suspect that anything had shifted. She seemed easier in her manner, the way people do when they believe a secret is safe. I noticed that she took phone calls in the backyard now, that she'd started deleting her text threads more regularly, that she smiled at her phone with a particular kind of private smile I hadn't seen in years and didn't recognize as being meant for me. I noticed all of it. I noticed it the way I'd been trained to, without reaction, without making the observation visible. In late April, I rented a furnished apartment 6 miles away and signed a 3-month lease. I moved essentials there over the course of several weeks, a duffel bag at a time, leaving nothing in the house that I couldn't walk away from. Then I waited. The first crack showed in early May. My wife came home one evening looking tight around the eyes. She said Sawyer's brand was going through some restructuring. She said it the way people say things they're pretending to know only casually. I said that was too bad and asked whether she wanted pasta or chicken for dinner. The investigation moved faster than I'd anticipated. By mid-May, Sawyer had apparently received formal correspondence from both the FDA and the State Department of Revenue. I knew this because my wife, rattled enough to be careless, left her phone on the kitchen counter face up that evening, and I saw the start of a message from him. "Ness, I need to tell you something, the government." I looked away before I read the rest. I'd already seen what I needed. I took another 2 weeks to be certain everything was in order. Beaumont had the documentation organized. My financial accounts were properly separated and labeled. I kept a written log, dates, details, everything I'd observed since March. In a notebook I kept in my truck, in case it was ever relevant in court. I chose a Sunday morning in early June. My wife was home. The kitchen light was good, and the coffee was fresh, and it felt, from the outside, like any of the 1,000 Sunday mornings we'd shared over 11 years. She was reading something on her phone when I sat down across from her at the table. I told her I knew about Sawyer. She went completely still. The phone stayed in her hands, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. I told her I'd known since March. I told her I wasn't angry, which was partially true. The anger had been there, but it had burned down to something quieter over those months, something more like resolve than heat. I told her I'd spent 3 months understanding the full picture before saying anything, because I'd learned a long time ago that decisions made in the center of a storm were almost always wrong. She started to speak. I let her. She said things that people say in these moments, that she'd felt lost, that she'd felt unseen, that somewhere in the past few years the marriage had stopped feeling like a partnership and she hadn't known how to tell me. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I understand, I'm filing for divorce. My attorney has already prepared the paperwork." She stared at me. I think she'd prepared herself for a different version of this. A fight, tears, a scene with raised voices and broken things. What she was looking at instead was a man sitting quietly with his coffee on a Sunday morning. "You hired an attorney," she said. 3 months ago. What about the house? What about everything we have together? My attorney will contact yours this week. Everything will be handled fairly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I think she'd been holding on to without knowing it. "You're not as simple as you always seemed. Are you?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," I said, "I'm not." I moved out that afternoon. I left her the furniture, the kitchen things, the art we'd picked out together. I left the house. What I took was the documentation, the truck, and the knowledge that Beaumont was about to show her representative exactly what the LLC contained, and exactly why none of it was marital property. Her attorney fought it. Of course they did. But the paper trail was clean and long and predated our marriage by years. We settled in September. She kept a portion of the jointly accumulated savings. I kept the properties. We split the remaining equity in the house after it sold. It was equitable in the dry legal sense of the word, which is what equitable distribution means. Sawyer's situation resolved around the same time. The FDA findings required mandatory product reformulation and a fine. The state tax matter took longer and went further than I'd expected. That was the part that ended with the handcuffs on a Tuesday morning in October. A compliance audit that escalated. Because he'd been less cooperative with investigators than he should have been. He was never charged with anything that sent him to prison. He was a corner cutter, not a serious criminal. But the investigations consumed 8 months of his life and legal fees that, I heard later through no effort of my own, ran well past 6 figures. His brand partnerships collapsed during the scrutiny. My wife's content deal with Elevate Naturals had been terminated before our divorce was even finalized. Which brings me back to standing across the street with my coffee, watching 8 state regulators walk into his building. The handcuffs were not something I'd planned for or anticipated. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching it. I'm human. But what I felt was less satisfaction than something quieter. The particular sensation of a long calculation finally arriving at its correct result. I drove to work. I inspected 3 buildings before noon. I ate lunch at a diner on Providence Road where I'd been going for years, because I like the coffee in the booth by the window and the fact that no one there has ever wanted anything from me except my order. I'm not going to tell you the year that followed was easy. It wasn't. 11 years is a long time to build a life with someone, even a life that turns out to have a false floor in it. There were evenings that were hard. There were long drives where I went back over the whole thing, looking for what I'd missed, what I could have done differently, whether any version of this story ended better. I still don't have clean answers to those questions. I may never have them. What I do have is this: a smaller house that belongs entirely to me, a portfolio of properties that has kept growing, a job I'm good at, and a clearer understanding of myself than I've had at any other point in my life. For 12 years, I was the kind of man that people underestimated. A county employee in a work truck. A man who looked at pipes and load calculations in buildings no one else thought about. My wife decided somewhere along the way that she knew what that meant. About my ceiling, about my ambitions, about what I was capable of. She was wrong. But I understood why she thought it. I had never given her a particular reason to think otherwise, because I'd never needed her to see it. I knew what I was. That was enough. It still is. The man who drives a county truck and looks at pipes all day. He knew exactly what he was doing the entire time. He just never felt the need to explain himself to anyone who hadn't bothered to ask.